Welcome back, Sebastian here. So we have 8 races left in the 2023 Formula One season, and with that I wanted to take a look at the battle for second place in the Constructors Championship. So I put 4 teams on the board, but realistically only 3 of them have a chance of winning the Constructors title, and those are of course Mercedes, Ferrari, and Aston Martin. But I've included McLaren in this video because they've looked very good last 5 or 6 races, and they've also do have a chance of catching one of the teams on this board, I think. So we'll start with the current points total. So Mercedes right now second in the Constructors, 273 points, split between their 2 drivers, Hamilton 164, Russell 109. Ferrari moved up to 3rd place this past weekend at the Italian Grand Prix, 228 points, 117 for Sainz, 111 for Leclerc. Aston, of course, fell to 4th place in the Constructors, 217 points, the majority of which, of course, are Alonso's, 170 for Alonso and 47 for Stroll. Then we have McLaren, 115 points, 102 points behind Aston Martin, with Norris having 79 points and Piastri on 36. So the reason that I wanted to do this video was I wanted to look at looking at why, what factors have contributed to the Constructors order being the way it is. And I think looking at how the teams have done compared to each other in qualifying and in the race, I think was a really fascinating way to look at it. So I've ranked them here, going through the 14 races we've had so far this season, ranked them 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Just among these 4 teams. I know Red Bull is first the vast majority of the time, and there's other races where the Alpines, for example, have mixed it up with these teams, such as Monaco, for example. But just ranking them within these 4 teams, first looking at Mercedes in qualifying, they've been first twice, second they've been 5 times, they've been second 5 times, and third 7 times, and they have not been the 4th fastest team in qualifying yet. By the way, just to measure this, I basically only took the lead drivers, so I only looked at the best driver from each team in qualifying and in the race. So I'm not looking at the second driver. Ferrari in qualifying, they were first 7 times, second 3 times, and third 2 times, and 4th 2 times as well. So they have the most first place finishes in qualifying amongst these 4 teams. Then we get to Aston. First 3 times, second 3 times, third 2 twice, and 4th 6 times. So they're actually tied for the most amount of times being slowest among the 4 teams in qualifying. Then we get to McLaren. First twice, second 3 times, third 3 times, and 4th 6 times. And so just looking at qualifying, I think it's clear that Ferrari's been the best team in qualifying. Having Charles Leclerc on that team will definitely help that. But the other really interesting thing to note is that Mercedes have only been first in qualifying twice, and despite that, they've been second and third quite often, and they've never been the slowest team. So generally very consistent from track to track, haven't really had any absolute bogey tracks where they've been absolutely awful. They have had races where they've had a driver knocked out in Q1, I believe in the sprint, but for this I didn't look at the sprints. They have had drivers knocked out in Q2 a couple times. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is that for qualifying, the profiles for Aston and McLaren, despite the fact that there's a 100-point difference here, are not that different, and despite the fact that McLaren started off the season so poorly. Like, just looking at the table, I didn't put it up here, but McLaren were basically slowest for the first 5 or 6 races straight, and then after that they've barely been the slowest in qualifying, and that's really been where Aston Martin's been struggling a lot. The last 5 or 6 races has been in qualifying. And I think, just looking at these 8 drivers, I think no questions asked, Stroll is definitely the weak link there in terms of both race and qualifying. But I think reality is, just looking at qualifying, I think, Alonso would probably be out-qualified by most of the other drivers on this board. He did out-qualify Ocon last year, I believe. But these are still very, very good drivers, and while Alonso's a fantastic driver, I think in qualifying, just qualifying alone, I think most of these other drivers I would pick over him. Now we move on to the race, which of course is the more important one because that's where the points are scored. Mercedes first twice, second 8 times, third 3 times, and fourth once. Ferrari first 4 times, second 3 times, third 5 times, and fourth 2 times. Aston first 6 times, second twice, third 4 times, and fourth 2 times as well. Then McLaren first twice, second once, third twice, and fourth 9 times. So you can see that despite, so let's see, so first with McLaren, despite the fact that in qualifying their profile is honestly pretty similar to the Aston's, race pace generally has not been there compared to Aston's, so as indicated by the fact they finished fourth 9 times. Of course, they've had a couple of really good races, Britain and Hungary come to mind, but looking at Aston, for example, right, they have more first place finishes amongst lead drivers compared to any other team. And that's basically thanks to Alonso, who has 170 points, fighting with Hamilton for third place in the Drivers' Championship. And it really shows that if you took one of these other drivers and you replaced Stroll and put that driver in that seat, they would probably have easily 30, 40, 50 more points than they do now, I think, no questions asked. And that alone would basically probably move Aston into clear second in the Constructors' Championship. But, unfortunately, that's not how it is. It's Alonso and Stroll, and that's the lineup that they've chosen. Looking at Ferrari, they do have some really good races, but they also have some races where they've been really, really poor. And I think that's unfortunately been the way it's been for Ferrari. Looking at the tracks that they're best at, Azerbaijan, Austria, Belgium, Italy, generally higher speed tracks, tracks that don't really require a ton of downforce, especially on the front end of the car. And to me, it's very, very similar to Ferrari in 2019 with the SF90. These were all tracks that they were very strong at in 2019. Of course, there's a couple others as well, like Bahrain, which they could have gotten. They could have been the lead team amongst this group, if not for Leclerc's engine. Canada, they had excellent race pace that race. Qualifying in the rain was a struggle, but that being said, Ferrari do have some tracks where they do look very, very close and have looked very close to the Red Bull. This past weekend, for example, race pace wasn't really there, but especially in one lap qualifying pace, very, very close. And then we get to Mercedes. Mercedes have only been first in the race twice, which I think really surprised me. Those races were Australia and Spain, tracks that, with the changes to both tracks, generally more high-speed tracks, but they both require a lot of front-end downforce. But you can really see the consistency between their two drivers and just the fact that they're consistently almost always second between Hamilton and Russell, showing that they're generally always there, always able to consistently pick up points, even if those standout performances and podiums aren't always there. So I think really just looking at all this data, it's hard. I think we can kind of look at it and say, which teams do we think have the best chance of finishing second? I do think that Mercedes, just based on their driver lineup alone, and the fact that they're not as peaky, and their two drivers are able to consistently get solid points finishes, gives them a massive advantage over, I think, both Ferrari and Aston, who, while on their peak, are probably faster than the Mercedes. They're too inconsistent. I think Ferrari have made a lot of mistakes this year, operationally, strategically, sometimes reliability as well. And for Aston, it's really Stroll holding the team back a lot. And the last thing I want to just look at is just looking at the point split between in the first 14 races, split between the first 7 races and the second 7 races. So for Mercedes, first 7 races, 152 points. So the first 7 races was, of course, Bahrain to Spain, and then the second 7 is Canada to Italy. So the race we just had, 152 points for Mercedes, first 7 races, second 7 races, 121. So they've actually had about 30 less points, second 7 races. Ferrari, 100 points the first 7 races, 128 the second 7. So a bit of a strong improvement for there, which of course allowed them to pass Aston Martin. Biggest difference, I think, or actually no, not the biggest difference, but biggest drop for sure. 134 points the first 7 races, 83 points the second 7 races. That upgrade package they brought around Canada, Austria did not help the car at all. If anything, it made it worse, and they've tried to correct things. Zandvoort was a really good step in the right direction, but it's hard to say how much that was track dependent, weather dependent. So I think the next couple of races coming up, Singapore, Japan, will be a really good indicator of where Aston stand. Of course, assuming things stay dry. And then we get to McLaren. Only 17 points in the first 7 races. 98 points the second 7 races. So that 98 points is clear, about 15 clear, exactly 15 clear of Aston Martin, and is a little bit behind both Mercedes and Ferrari. So I think realistically, I think in the Constructors Championship, I think Mercedes probably finished second as it is. But that being said, if Ferrari can somehow figure out their race pace issues and figure out how to get pace more consistently across a variety of tracks, Ferrari could be a threat to second place. Aston Martin, Stroll would basically have to have the form of his life the last 8 races, and they would have to probably be consistently second best. Then we get to McLaren. I think McLaren, realistically, they're not going to be able to get up to Mercedes. Red Bull would have to start DNFing almost every other race, and they would have to capitalize and get multiple wins to be able to get that points difference down. Like, for context, to be able to clear the 100-point difference between themselves and Aston, they would need to basically score 150 points or so over the last 8 races, and Aston would have to score about 50. So Aston would basically have to be consistently pretty poor, being the fourth fastest team for the rest of the year, and McLaren would have to be second. So while I think not really possible, with Stroll's form and his lack of form for that matter, and I think if Piastri and Norris continue to have a really good second half of the season, it's possible, but I think it's definitely a long shot. So I think that's my look at the battle for second in the Constructors Championship. I think definitely probably one of the more intriguing battles left that we have for this season, now that the Drivers' Championship, Constructors' Championship are pretty much already settled. So thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so, or if you're new to the channel. I know I got a lot of new viewers after the Liam Lawson video, which was a bit of a surprise. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.